Now we have Carrissa, that she doesn't have the microphone on. And I see a mouth moving, but without sound.
I have to transcribe.
Oh, there we go. So yeah, can someone pray for her before we start?
I mean, I can. Yeah. I'm here. Yeah, dear Lord, we just want to thank you for Carrissa, for everything that you have put on her heart to share today, God, that you would calm any nerves that she's feeling, any thoughts that are going crazy in her head, God, that you would just calm everything and help her to think clearly and communicate clearly what you have given her to share today, God. So, yeah.
All yours, Carrissa.
Sweet. Forgot one thing. I'm sorry. Give me 1 second. I forgot
The
my
Bible. That's important.
Hello. My name's Carrissa. For those of you who I haven't met yet, I've been staff here for about 3 years. I helped lead photography track and Carrissa magazine and the social media. So, yeah. And today I'm going to be teaching on perfectionism versus excellence. So, yes, a lot of what like Joey was saying in her teaching, I was like, oh yeah, like she kind of touched on it in quite a few different areas. So it's going to be fun to go to that. Cool. Okay, sweet. So if I'm being honest, this is probably the last thing that I really want to teach on. It's something that I have been struggling with a lot recently. So it's one of those where you have to teach on it, but you're in the middle of it. So it's a good time. Yeah, and it's also a teaching that each time I talk about it, I almost can't perfect it because each new time that I teach on it, God has taught me something different, or he's asking me to talk about different sides of it. So that's also frustrating when you're a perfectionist because you can never perfect the thing that you're teaching on. So that's also a fun lesson. Yeah. Yeah, and if you have any questions during it or if you need things explained, just let me know. Yes. Okay, so it's really weird. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so my first kind of question for you guys is what is perfectionism? Sometimes it can be one of those things that gets a lot confused really easily with different things. So some things that it can be confused with is being detail-oriented or hardworking or diligent. But the actual definition of perfectionism is refusing to accept any standard other than what is considered perfect. So it's kind of a mindset. It's what you deem to be what is perfect. So it's like your own perspective of something. Yeah, perfectionism is striving to be flawless. Obviously, we're Christians. We're not called to be flawless, you know. God always works through our mistakes, so it's one thing why it's not so great. Yeah. And it's also a doctrine holding that perfection is attainable. So it can be a mindset that you have sometimes that perfectionism enough for it, or and that can cause a lot of striving for things. So yeah. Yeah, and in a way it's how we, like I said before, it's a perspective. So it's how you view yourself or other people. It can cause you to put standards on yourself or others that are not really made to be there. Yeah, and as well, it can be standards that we've received from other people, like our friends, our parents, or society. So yeah, it's basically just a perspective that God never intended for us to have, but it can be quite sneaky in how it shows up in our lives. So I'm going to go over a few, different ways that it applies in our life. But Yeah. Yeah. And so when we're talking about like the difference between perfectionism and excellence, excellence still has to do with like working hard and trying to give your best. But the difference of it is your heart. So if your heart is to be perfect so that you feel like validated or loved, it's not so great. But whereas excellence has everything to do with serving God and trying to give him your best. Okay, so a few of the reasons that we strive to be perfect. Yeah, one of the reasons is that we want to be loved. So we try to be perfect so that other people will love us or think, yeah, essentially that we want to be loved. We strive to be perfect in order to feel worthy. This you see a lot in the New Testament, in where it talks about how Jesus came and he died, but then the Jewish people after this couldn't let go of their religion and see kind of the perspective of Christianity because they were so used to like earning God's love and earning their salvation. So it makes it really hard to believe that grace is possible because of the amount of years that they spent proving that they were worthy. Yeah. And this actually, I think I was reading, I think in Mark, where it talked about how even some of the Israelites will never access their full inheritance because of their refusal to let go of the religion and earning his love and grace, which is really sad to think about, actually. Yeah. Which brings me to my next point of we strive to be perfect in order to earn grace. So if you ever make a mistake or you really failed at something, if you're a perfectionist, it's really hard to accept grace because you don't feel like you deserve it. And so instead of accepting it like a normal person, you kind of reject it until you fix it. Yeah. And we also strive to be perfect because we're afraid of rejection. So if we're not good enough or we're not perfect enough, then we fear that people won't want us or they won't want to be our friend or, yeah, just all the aspects of rejection. So those are some reasons that we try to be perfect. And then the different effects that perfectionism can have on your life. Also, if you're taking notes and I'm talking too slow, like do a hand motion or like put your note mic on and just let me know. We're talking too fast. But
sorry, then can you say the second point that we like strive for perfectionism either to be loved, and then what was the second one?
Or to feel worthy. Cool. Yeah, so the effects perfectionism can have on your life is it steals your joy. So when, it's kind of like the artist in the movie who has been working on this piece for like months and months, and everyone looks at it and they're like, oh wow, like that's amazing, but they actually never find the joy in it because they see all the flaws and all the mistakes in it, and so it can really steal that joy of creating that God created us to have. Yeah, perfectionism doesn't extend grace. Like I said, it's hard to receive grace, so you don't extend it to others as well. So sometimes we subconsciously hold others to the same standards that we hold ourselves to. Yeah. And it doesn't leave room for growth. So if you are striving to be perfect and you make a mistake, then sometimes that can stop you from trying again or trying to learn from your mistakes. Instead, you kind of are like, oh, like I screwed up, so that's the end of it, you know? So it can really stunt your growth. And because honestly, like most times we learn from our mistakes and we learn so many new things, but if we are so focused on fear of failing, then it makes it really hard to do that. Yeah, my next point is it creates a fear of failing. So this has a lot to do with anxiety as well. Like if you start something and you already are anxious about it, like, oh, like what if it's not good enough? What if it, like you start getting very pessimistic about like how it could end up. Yeah. Yeah, perfectionism makes you very independent because you want to be perfect, so you don't want to need anything. So this includes people. So you don't need people if you are enough, and that if you do good enough. So it kind of isolates you and yeah, just makes you really independent. Yeah, and lastly, it revolves a lot around me and what I'm capable of rather than what God can do through me. So it's the mindset of it is very much so focused on what I can do and what I can accomplish, which leaves no room for God to move through us. So, yeah. Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier, I don't remember, but perfectionism can cause a lot of like pressure in your life, pressure to perform, pressure to, yeah, be the best person that you can be, which isn't terrible at times, but if it's to the point of where you have a lot of fear and can't actually be real with people, that's when you can notice that it's starting to become an issue. Yeah, and the amount of pressure that it puts on you can cause a lot of like anxiety, like I said earlier. So because you become so afraid of not meeting that standard. Yeah, and I struggle a lot with this in almost every area of my life. But one of the areas that I'm going to talk about is chasm. Like for some of you who don't know, like, or haven't seen it, like we started a magazine a couple years ago, and I have taken maybe one graphic design course in college, so I never really felt like adequately equipped to do a magazine. I kind of downloaded InDesign one time and have been watching lots of YouTube videos on how to do it. Yeah, so a lot of times when I start creating it, I struggle a lot with the fear that it won't be good enough or I don't know enough, so I shouldn't be the one creating it. Yeah, which in the beginning it was really fun. It was really easy because it was new and I was just experimenting, but I think as we've gone on, like it's become more intense each time for me because I feel like I have to level up each time or find a new find a new way of doing things or refine things or do things better. So each time we kind of come on to a new issue, I have noticed that I started panicking and having a lot more anxiety than actually having joy in creating it. Yeah, but then this is kind of where I've had to learn to reevaluate. Like, I forget that why we created the magazine. It wasn't to have a visually like perfect piece. It wasn't to be Vogue or Elle or any other magazine. It was created to reach out to people, artists in the area, and worldwide. Like we ultimately would like to be, just a magazine that has a widespread reach on like all different ages and all different artists and be very real about life and art, but also impact people with Jesus through the magazine, even though it's not like openly Christian. So some of the reasons that like I have had to stop myself when creating is because I start putting so much pressure on how it looks rather than what the heart of the magazine is. And like I said, like this last issue has been really difficult because it's our fourth one. So I have this mental kind of image of what it should look like, or the standard should be. And so it is even put me at a complete stop. Like God asked me to stop creating it a few weeks ago. And that was really hard because again, as perfectionist, I can view it as, oh, I failed. Like he doesn't want me to do this. Like I didn't do it well enough. So but instead he's been teaching me about like re-evaluating where my heart is for it and where my priorities are in the magazine. Yeah, so I've had to work through a lot of like anxiety and pressure and just like my own perspective of myself and how I do the magazine in order to realign it with God's heart and see what he wants to do through it. Because honestly, like our first issue of the magazine is absolutely filled with mistakes. Like I sat in one day in quarantine, and I just read it cover to cover, and I was like, I just wanted to go through it with like a pen and just kind of like highlight all the mistakes. And I was just like, oh, like seeing all the different places where nothing was like centered or different things like that. But if I'm being honest, like the most feedback we've gotten that it has impacted people's lives is that one. The second one has been good, you know, the third one, great. But the most, the most times that people have said like, hey, wow, like this gave me a lot of hope, like this renewed a lot of like strength in me, has been through that one. And that's the first time that I really saw like how God says like he can work through our mistakes, and it actually happened. Because I don't know, honestly, like always believe that. I'm just like, this is a nice saying that we say to make ourselves feel better. But it's so true, and it was so cool to like, it wasn't cool, it didn't feel cool at all. But it was the first time that I tangibly saw like how if I removed myself from like the center of it, and the center of just what I was feeling about it or how I saw myself, and put God in the middle, like how he could actually move through it. Because trying to be perfect doesn't leave space for God, and people end up looking to us instead of God. So if we are these perfect people who create these perfect things, then you kind of create a lack of hope for other people, because it's really hard like to look up to people if you never see yourselves as like being able to reach the same standard that they do. Yeah. Yeah. And so sometimes when we feel as if we are failing or not meeting a standard, rather than reaching out for help, we tend to hide or strive to be better on our own. Yeah, and this has a lot to do with what Joey was talking about earlier with the vulnerability, like being a disciple and opening up to your discipler. Because honestly, for me, that's like when I hit my like pride the most, because I see it face to face, because I'm like, oh, I wasn't perfect, and I have to talk to somebody else about it, and that like sometimes destroys me. But it's really good. It's a good type of destroying. Yeah. And honestly, sometimes like this is why in the church, like we see so many, like especially younger Christians or older Christians, like they leave the church, is because they can become quite exhausted and burned out from trying to meet the standard that religiosity places on them. So instead of being real and open with God and finding healing or finding more of his truth, everyone pretends like everything is okay. And we try to uphold this image of ourselves in order to look perfect to other people, because that's oftentimes like our pride, because we don't want people to know that we're imperfect. Yeah. Well, I'm going to read from Romans 8:15. And I really like this verse because it talks a lot about how we're supposed to be viewed. So I'm just going to read it first. Okay, and it says, "And you did not receive the spirit of religious duty, leading you back into fear of never being good enough, but you have received the spirit of full acceptance, enfolding you into the family of God. And you will never feel orphaned, for as he rises up within us, our spirits join in him, saying words of tender affection, beloved Father." Yeah, and in the footnotes here, it says it can also refer to the fear of judgment that has been removed from us through Christ. Yeah, and this is always just like a really good reminder to me that I'm not here for what I can do or how good I can be, but you've already been accepted into God's family. Yeah, I think it's really powerful, the spirit of full acceptance, that part. Yeah. Because honestly, this is one of the biggest lies I think that we encounter, that we are here for what we can do rather than who we are. But yeah. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about more about pride and how, yeah, just like what happens when we lead on pride rather than grace. Yeah. Yeah, because the point in perfectionism, when we are too proud to show that we are imperfect, is kind of when we hit the most like roadblocks, when it kind of stunts your growth and makes it really hard to continue on, or just to learn more about who God is and his grace and his love, because our pride almost like stumps us from getting closer to him. Yeah. And oftentimes when we have perfectionism, we either put ourselves on this pedestal, like, wow, I did this so good, like, look how great I am, or we think we're worthless. And you're not normally one or the other, like, you kind of swing. Like, some days when you do really good, like, you can be like, oh, wow, like, you just kind of take all the pride and you're like, okay, like, I'm perfect, like, I can do this, you know. And then the next day, something minor happens and you just, like, completely swing to the other side. And that isn't healthy at all, because God didn't create us for that. He created us to be balanced in him. Yeah. And so when we put God at the center of it, we can remember that it's not what we do, whether we succeed or we fail. It's who we are in him. And that kind of ties in, like, listening to the identity teachings yesterday really helped me kind of just realign, like, and helped me stop putting like all of my identity in like what I can do or how well I did it, but instead putting it in God. Yeah. And one of the best ways to go against pride is vulnerability. Yeah. Yeah, and this is probably one of my strongest places that I struggle in, because struggling with perfectionism, I really don't like being open or like having people see what I'm struggling with, or yeah, just having any sort of like failure or anything like that. Yeah, and even like with this teaching, I've been asking God, like he's pointed out different things he wants me to talk about, and the whole time I was just like, why? Like, why? What is the point of being open? What is the point of letting other people in? Yeah, just because sometimes there's so many lies even surrounding that. But something that he told me was vulnerability speaks of victory. Yeah, because in being vulnerable, we can be open with the times that we failed. But in those moments, I've seen God move through my life and bring more victory than any others. And so in saying yes to being vulnerable, other people have a chance to see how he was victorious in my life. Yeah. Yeah, because oftentimes I like to believe that I'm strong and capable and I don't need anybody else's help, or I can do it all on my own. Yeah, and so when I see like areas that God is asking me to be vulnerable in, like in my eyes, those are seen as weaknesses. Those are seen as like moments that I failed or that I should probably just forget existed. But those are the moments that I saw how much God was for me and how he was going to use me. Because there have been many times where I didn't feel like I had, even like discipling people, like I didn't feel like I had the right words or didn't have the enough wisdom to teach. But there have been many times when God used me even stronger through there. Like, yeah, that was really confusing. I'm going to sum it up better. Yeah, just the different times that I haven't felt like I had the right words, like almost that's like when we're tired, when we feel weak. Like I've seen God move so strongly through me. Like I started speaking things I didn't know I had in me. But that is what happens when we let God work in our weaknesses. Yeah. But yeah. Yeah, and I'm also going to talk a little bit more about just like what happens when we aren't willing to be vulnerable. Just like when we have too much pride to actually like speak up and be real with where we're at, because it's quite isolating sometimes. But the movie that I have an analogy of is Devil Wears Prada. Yes, classic. But it's about a girl who becomes like a secretary for this magazine editor, and this lady has like everything is perfect, like to a T, like her outfits, like her life. It's amazing. Yeah, I don't want it all, but
No spoilers.
yeah. Yeah, but she's always perfect, and she's always has this really high standard, and everyone's wanting to work with her, and everyone wants to be around her or even intern for her. Yeah, but she's as you like watch the movie more, you can see how in her actual life she's quite lonely, and like I think her marriage is falling apart, and she's just has so many like fears and brokenness. But because she's so afraid to let people in and let people see, because of the pride, she's all alone. Yeah. And this kind of goes back to the fear that if we let anybody see that we aren't perfect, we won't be loved or accepted. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so next thing I'm going to talk about is shame. Because oftentimes when we refuse to open up about imperfections and we hide them and we hide behind like walls and fake smiles, it's all because we're hiding in shame. Yeah. And what happens when we live in shame is it silences us. And yeah, and that's a really dangerous place to be, because when you're not open about something and when you refuse to talk about it, yeah, then that's where a lot of lies can come in. Like the enemy can use many lies when you're alone, to try to silence you and to try to lie to you about where you're at or who you are, or what you're capable of. So yeah, so shame is something that, yeah, is very, I don't want to say powerful, but it kind of is in the way that it stumps what you're able to do. Yeah. Yeah, and I liked what they were talking about in the identity teachings about generational things as well, because oftentimes this can be something that is very generational. It can be, yeah, it's all of the family issues that kind of like, have you ever been like at your family dinner and there's like an issue, but no one wants to talk about it and no one wants to admit that there's something wrong and everyone's like pretending it's okay. Yeah. So it's something that kind of tells you it should be brushed under the rug and hidden. Yeah. And speaking of family issues, this is kind of something that I have struggled with for a long time. Yeah, because many of the women in my family have struggled with like eating disorders, and but no one ever talks about it. Because at some point, one woman was told like the lie that your value is in how you look rather than like who you are. Yeah, so I've kind of watched as it like has been passed down from like many generations in my family. Yeah. And I don't think it was till I was like 16 that I realized it wasn't normal, like, or that it was an issue in my life. Yeah, because no one ever talked about it. And was open about like, hey, that's quite negative the way you think about yourself. Like, that's not right. It was just kind of what you do. And so in one person's shame of not being willing to open it up, it kind of had a ripple effect. Yeah. So I really didn't realize that I even struggled with one until I was about 16, and I started having a lot of like health issues. And it even wasn't until like my DTS when I was 18 that I actually like talked about it with someone, or because I just assumed like this is what you live with because like that's what I've seen. And so when I was 18 and I came here to do my DTS, that was the moment that I really like started fighting it, because I had, even going home, like I watched as like one of my younger sisters started struggling with it, and that was like the biggest moment for me that I realized that I wanted to like fight it and not actually like let it win. But the biggest reason I was able to start fighting it was because I opened up, because I started talking about it, because I asked for discipleship in it. Because that was the moment that like kind of all of my pride and my shame was keeping me from opening up about it, because I was just too afraid of acknowledging it, really. Because pride stifles the real love that confronts us and calls us out. So if you've ever had a friend who like calls you out and is like, hey, like that's really dumb of you, don't do that, like that person really loves you, because the fake love will tell you it's okay, like don't talk about that, like just pretend to be fine. But it's in the moments that we are incredibly like open and honest that we can start seeing real change and healing happen. So this is a big reason why shame is incredibly detrimental to life, is because it can hinder healing from your life. And honestly, half the time that you start healing in something, it also has a ripple effect, and it starts healing for many people around you. And another thing that shame makes us do is hide from God. And we start avoiding what we've been called to do, because if we feel imperfect or we feel like we don't measure up, then sometimes we try to run away from God or his presence. Because we don't think that we're worthy of it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Adam and Eve. Because they were the first people to sin and fall short of God. But something that I was listening to Christine Kane's message, Unashamed, or that's the book. She has another message called Shame. And she was talking about how like when they first sinned, like they covered themselves and they were ashamed. They hid from God. And even in Genesis, I lost my verse. It was all set up. Okay, yeah. And then it says in Genesis 3:8, and they heard the voice of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of God amongst the trees. And this was kind of like, I really liked what she pointed out was in the first point that God made about creating Adam and Eve was that they knew no shame. He didn't mention that they knew no fear or they were always happy or always had peace, but he mentioned that they had no shame. And then she went on to talk about how like sometimes this is why this is the strongest thing that God uses to, or the enemy uses to attack you, is he will heap shame on you in order to make you ineffective. Because oftentimes when we feel ashamed of something or feel imperfect, like we kind of give up on being able to do it, or we just start to, not really have a good mindset of what God has like called us to do, or we can't really see how he will use us if we can't see past the mistakes. And another point that she was making was that like sometimes when the enemy attacks you and he puts a lot of shame on you, he's not only hindering you, but he's hindering the people on the other side of your obedience that will not be reached. Because when we open up and we are vulnerable and we go against all the shame and the pride, that's the times that God can move through us and reach out to other people. And then I'm just going to read another verse that I really like. It's 1 John 3:20. Yeah. Okay. And for this one, it was just a really good reminder when I found it. Like, it was just kind of God reminding me that like my own perspective of myself and how well I do is not his perspective. Because it says, whenever our hearts make us feel guilty and remind us of our failures, we know that God is much greater and much more merciful than our own conscience, and that he knows everything there is to know about us. And that I really loved, because when it talks about him knowing everything there is to know about us, that means that he knows about the mistakes that we're going to make, that he knows about when we're going to absolutely fail, like completely mess everything up. And yet he still chose us for this. So, yeah. And then in verse 21, I really like that it says, my delightfully loved friends, when our hearts don't condemn us, we have bold freedom to speak face to face with God. Because this kind of goes back to that if you have a lot of shame, or if you feel like you screwed up and you hide from God. But if, like, according to that verse, like he created us to come face to face to him in bold freedom. Because it's kind of like a child when they're asking their mom or dad for something, they kind of run in and they just ask for it. Like they don't think about what their mom and dad are going to think, if they'll be annoyed, they just, sometimes they jump on you like in the middle of the night. Like, so like children have no shame. They're like, this is what I want, please feed me. And then they just cry. So yeah, I have many younger siblings. So I think this is, I really enjoyed and not enjoyed that. The middle of the night moments, definitely mixed feelings, but it's fine. And then I'm going to talk about excellence. So we've talked about all the perfectionism, all of the downsides of it. There's that whole chunk. So now I'm going to talk about what it means to walk in excellence. And some words that are used to describe excellence is honorable, surpassing, to glow, to try, to choose, and to make or become great. And I love that each of these words aren't necessarily stagnant.
Carrissa, can you repeat that?
Yeah. So for excellence, it's honorable, surpassing, to glow, to try, to choose, and to make or become great. I really like the one to try, because like that one necessarily doesn't mean that you did amazing or you did terribly, just you tried. And I think oftentimes like that's all that really God wants from us, is like an openness and a willingness. Because sometimes when I've completely and utterly failed at something, and God still asks to use me, he just asks me like, will you give this to me? Like, will you look past what you think you can do and let me do what I want to do? And so just showing up and being available to God is a big part of excellence. And then I have a list of different, like what it means to walk in excellence. Yeah, so when you're walking in excellence, you're more concerned about giving and serving. Again, it's less about you and what you can do, but it's more about like how you can give and how you can serve. Excellence has to do with continual growth. So again, it's not like perfectionism in the way that there's a standard and that you either meet that standard or you don't. This one is a continuous growth that doesn't stop. So where I am this week, I hope I'm somewhere different next week. I hope walking in excellence, like this is good for today, but I'd like to be like more in tune with God or more aligned with God next week. Yeah. There was this one time that I was being discipled. Carrie is my discipler, and she described me as like a child in like primary school, like crying because I'm not in high school, essentially. And it was so accurate for me because like sometimes I like, even in thinking about growth, I become so idealistic, like that I'm like, oh, like one day I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna be so great at this, and I'm gonna be great about being vulnerable or whatever. And then I like, after talking about all that, I look at where I'm at and I start to feel discouraged because I'm like, oh, like I couldn't even tell that person how I was actually doing today, like, you know. So but it's not about like where you want to be, it's about where God has you today. Because if God wanted me to be a high schooler, this is a really weird analogy, then I would be, but I'm not. Yeah, thank God. Yeah, so just remembering that like continual growth is like walking in excellence is being okay with where you're at today, but allowing God to work in you and continue to grow your life. And the next point is walking in excellence means you are teachable. So this one is really hard for me because every time I'm discipled and told that I did something wrong, I kind of like, sometimes I go off the deep end and I'm like, oh my goodness, like can't handle it. It becomes this huge deal to me. But that's not like, if we know that we are loved and that we are loved no matter what we do or what we can or can't do, then when we are corrected, then we can know that it's from a heart that is wanting the best for us. So being teachable has a lot to do with, honestly, a lot to do with pride. And like, if we think we have all the answers, we're not very teachable. If we think that we know what perfect is, we're not very teachable. Yeah. Which goes along a lot with my next point of excellence is being humble. Yeah, because it's walking with the, not a know-it-all kind of mindset, but walking with a mindset of like, I might not have the full perspective that God has. It's seeking what other people, how other people see things and how other people walk in their relationships with God. Because we can always be learning and growing. Literally everybody, even the person you dislike the most, can teach you something about God. Like, it's just about how humble and how willing you are to be taught by Him. So, yeah. Next, excellence creates dependence. Because if you've read any of your Bible, you can see that you are not meant to do things alone. Yeah, because God has created us to depend on other people, because it would be, actually life would be pretty terrible if you did everything on your own and you could only rely on yourself. Like, I can't imagine how hopeless that would be, at least for me. Yeah. And so when we are walking in excellence, we can depend on other people. We can acknowledge the fact that we can't do everything, but we are going to give our best, and that other people can come in and help us. Yeah, it's really important for creating community as well, because if you have one person who's the leader who can do everything on their own, like, why is everybody else there? What is the point, essentially? Yeah. And then on top of that, excellence strengthens our trust in God. Yeah. And this is probably one of the hardest that I've had to learn, is trusting God and trusting that He knows where He has me now, that He knows where He's going to take me. Because in my perfectionism and control, I would like to know everything, and I would like to almost like know everything so that I can prepare myself and do it all myself, rather than trust that God will show me where he wants to be, where he wants me to be when the time is. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and excellence is surrendering not only the glory to God when we do great things, but it's also surrendering all of the mistakes. Because in perfectionism, we carry the weight of everything, but in excellence, we can actually surrender the weight of both of our mistakes and what we do right. Because that's kind of how like God works through our mistakes, is that they're his, that if we give them over to him, then he can actually do something with them. If we hold on to them, then they're ours and they're kind of stagnant. And one example of people moving in excellence in God and still being used by God, even if they're imperfect, is actually the lineage of Christ. I started, I think, in March when we first went into lockdown I bought like the new Passion Translation Bible. It's really nice. I love it. But it's just the New Testament. And I was like, why not just like read it cover to cover? Like I'm only in Mark, didn't get very far, but it's been really good. And I was just like, chapter 1, I think I opened it up and I was like, I'm going to read this thing. It's going to be great. And I decided as well, I wanted to study it and like actually go beyond like the surface of what the Bible was and actually try to dig into it a bit more. And the first chapter is like this whole list of names of like how Jesus is a direct descendant of David. And normally I just kind of skim the list because I can never pronounce the names. So I can't I must just be really lazy because I like kind of look at the names and then just like pass them. I don't even try to pronounce it in my mind. And then as well, it's just kind of boring to me. Like I'm just like, wow, names, but this time I was like really, I don't know, I had a lot of energy that day, I guess. I was just like, no, like I'm gonna read all the names, and I started reading them. And quite a few of the names stuck out to me because this is like the lineage of Christ. This is like how he came to be in the world. So these people must be like amazing, like, top-notch humans. But then I started reading them, and the first one that stuck out was Rahab. She was a prostitute. Ruth was not even Jewish. Bathsheba wasn't even David's wife. Jeconiah, I don't know how to say this one. He actually like had a curse on his lineage from being able to be on the physical throne of Israel. But it was really cool how like God still made a way for him to be one of the he was a part of like the lineage of Christ.
What was his name?
Jeconiah. It's in Matthew 1. Jeconih. Hopefully that helps. And then there was Manasseh. And this guy, like, he worshipped other gods, and he was kind of a wild king. He did whatever he wanted. Like, he had, I think, I don't remember his whole story, but it wasn't until like the very end of his life when he was set to be like hung or something like that. Like he was just gonna die. That he cried out to God, and God turned him into a king for him. And so all of these people who weren't exactly great, messed up a lot in their lives. They were descendants used to bring Jesus to earth. And that really stuck with me because, like, again, like we hear so often that like God uses our mistakes, but it's not often that I actually believe it. And then something that I forget which message I was listening to, but it's by Stephen Furtick, and something that he said like really stuck with me. He says, never doubt that God has a purpose for your life because God has options, and he could use anyone, but he chose you. And that really stuck with me too, because like how many people are on this earth, and God chose you to be here, and he chose you to be working in the area that you are. And it wasn't just because like he ran out of options. He was like, oh, just like grab this girl. I guess she can make a magazine. You know, like no, he specifically chose you to be, yeah, just to be where you are. And that is always really like encouraging to me. Like, cause sometimes I have no idea why, you know, and I just like, I don't know why I'm here or what I'm actually doing. But just the fact that like God has thought this through and he has a plan and that he has a promise, always really helps me calm down. Yeah. And another area that was really cool to see how God uses imperfect people was in Mark 3. It's talking about his disciples and choosing his disciples. And it's kind of the part where he gives them all nicknames. Yeah, so I'm just going to read it. It's Mark 3:14 through 16. If I can find it. Okay, and it says he appointed yes, he appointed the 12 whom he named disciples or apostles. He wanted them to be continually at his side as his friends so that he could send them out to preach and to have authority to heal the sick and cast out demons. He appointed his 12 and gave Simon the nickname Peter and the Rock. And he gave the brothers Jacob and John, the sons of Zebedee, the nickname Bene Rega, which means passionate sons. And they really stuck out to me because I was reading the footnotes and it says this nickname can also be translated to sons of loud shouts or passionate sons or sons of commotion, easily angered, sons of thunder. Yeah. And it says that Jesus giving the brothers this nickname acknowledged that they were two rowdy boys, thunderous and passionate. Because again, like the disciples aren't as old as we picture them to be. Yeah, and I always picture like the disciples as these like really old guys who are like monks and like very quiet, like don't really speak much until they're like told to. But just the fact that he chose yeah, people who had a lot of passion, and it even states some places that they spoke before they were thinking, that they just blurted things out. Yeah, and sometimes they ask like really stupid questions, which is really helpful to me because otherwise I'd be asking these stupid questions, but I wouldn't have Jesus like right in front of me, you know. So I really appreciated this extra kind of explanation about the disciples because it kind of helped me, yeah, just see more of how God used people who came from different backgrounds, had made many mistakes. Even it talks about in the Bible their mistakes after they're with him, because sometimes I think like after I become a better Christian, like that's where the mistakes end and I won't make any more. That's a pretty big lie. Yeah. So it's always like encouraging. So another thing about this is it's so encouraging sometimes to see other people fail, which sounds terrible, but it almost like it makes it attainable to me. Or if you hear, like I love watching or reading other people's interviews about how they got to be sorry, got to be where they were is yeah, because oftentimes it's not the perfect I did everything right and now I'm here. It's oftentimes like mistake after mistake after like pushing and pushing. Yeah, because that's how we're supposed to be. We're human. We're supposed to be able to relate to other people through our mistakes and kind of almost like lend a hand in that. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think this is all that I have in my notes. Yeah, it's just a lot about laying down our pride and our past and our perspective and shame and everything that is honestly about us so that we can actually move forward in learning who God actually created us to be and how he wants to use us. Yeah. Cool. Does anybody have any questions? Or do you need anything explained?
I actually have a quick question, but it's more like a statement that I've been sort of thinking about. Like, I think with the whole sort of like telling people about, you know, what's going on and like what you're dealing with, and like saying, oh, I've messed up, you know, and I need some help. Like, I feel like part of me like went for a time when I was like, oh, I don't need to tell them because they got bigger problems. I don't want to take up their time. But I feel like I'm past that now. But I feel like I'm more in the place where I don't want to be like self-pitying. I don't know, like I feel like if I was to go to someone and say, I've really messed up, I need you to help me, like I'm just in a bad place and da 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 da, I feel like I'm wanting to receive this help because I'm kind of pitying myself and I want a helping hand. Like, I'm not really sure what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I can definitely see like I think this is something that I often kind of do the same thing with. I'm like, oh, like they have bigger problems, or I'm just looking for attention, like, you know, like many different things and why I don't ask for help. But honestly, like if you're going to the right people, and like if you're going to someone who you know is going to give you advice that edifies you, then that's not self-pity, because self-pity is quite stagnant and it kind of keeps you where you are, and you kind of like wallow in like the mistake that you made. But if you're making the active choice to go ask for help and how to like grow and learn from what you did, then that is walking in excellence, actually. So, yeah.
Hi, Carrissa. Thank you. Really beautiful. Also, I struggle a lot with this topic, so I can relate completely. And something that I really liked that you said, it was that excellence is more about giving and serving. But that's like not what I've been taught all my life, you know, like, or the things that I have fight for and this and that, and like in the kitchen world, it's not about that. It's about you being the best and, you know, being tough and, you know, like just having everything under control and this and that. So it's like a completely new way of seeing this, you know. And I've heard some other teachings about this, so because like I was kind of making the idea of this, but I didn't see it as it's about giving and serving. I'm like, man, that's like nothing to do with what I do, you know. So it's cool, and I also like what you said, that is a continual growth. So it means that it's kind of about being a better person than I was, you know, last month or last week, in what I can do better tomorrow, not like a standard of whatever, you know, like, so it's really cool.
I really like the fact that with excellence, like if you look at the list with excellence and perfectionism, like perfectionism is all about results. It's about like success or failure, and either I succeeded because I met the goal that I had for myself, or I failed. And the goal is so like objective. It's subjective. I don't know which one. The one where you decide. It's like I have decided that this is the perfect result, and it could be not anyone else's perfect results. It's just that I decided that's what I want, and then it's like success, failure. Whereas like the excellence doesn't even have results on it. It's like it's not about results at all. It's about your heart attitude. And I think like that just really spoke to me, just that there's never going to be a moment where you're like, cool, this is excellence. It's like, that's the point. It's like a continuous process with no defined particular lines. And we're never going to be really good at excellence, because that would be perfectionism. So yeah, that really spoke to me.
Yeah. That's probably the most frustrating part for me, because if I could have a list of what is right and what is wrong and how to like get results, oh my goodness, like it'd be amazing. But that also is like not healthy. So yeah, it's really cool. Like I haven't actually ever put the two lists like side by side, so that was a really good perspective of it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's also interesting that uh, I feel like we were talking about the difference between perfectionism and excellence because a lot of people, and me included, like I just didn't think about them being separate things. But it turns out they're the opposite of each other, like almost exactly the opposite. And also, just a thought that I had as you were talking about the disciples, but the fact that the disciples were able to just blurt out stupid questions shows how comfortable they were with Christ. And so if the disciples who were literally with him were able to come to him and be vulnerable and like say, I don't get this is, and he's like, that's a stupid question, but I love you anyway.
Yeah.
Like how much more are we able to do that, or just the exact same? So I thought that was cool. I never thought about that before.
It's true.
Oh, sorry, I'm speaking too much. But just as you said that, I suddenly realized, like, while Jesus was walking with the disciples, he hadn't died for our sins yet. So it was before their sins had been washed away, and they still had that confidence. And it's like, our sins have been washed away. We should have so much more confidence to come before God. Because, like, all those stupid things they did and the stupid things that they said, like, that was before Jesus could just turn to them and be like, I just count it all because when God looks at you, he sees Christ. And that's what he's saying to us. So, like, thank you, Mariah.
It's true. Sometimes I think about like if we didn't have shame, or if we didn't have the amount of pride and like issues that we do, like if we came to God with that bold like freedom and faith to do so, like how different like all of our lives would be. Like if we came to God with the same confidence that he loved us no matter what. That's why I think it's one of those things that is the most attacked, because the enemy is scared of it the most. So. Cool.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much for Carrissa for sharing with us. It was really good. Before we close, do you mind just praying for us?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, I really want to thank you for this time that we've had just this week, really, to go into more of who you've created us to be. And we want to thank you for the perspectives that you're changing, God, and just the different things that you've spoken to each person, God. That this wouldn't just be surface level, God, that you would just take it deeper, and that we would have time to really contemplate what it means and who you are. And yeah, God, I just want to ask that you would bless everyone here, God, that they would grow closer to you and be able to walk in that bold faith that they are loved unconditionally. In your name, amen.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Don't forget, guys, we have small groups tonight. So yeah, that should be at the normal time. So we will talk to a lot of you guys later. Cool. Thank you, Carrissa.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.